Buying a house is usually an exciting prospect. It is a sign that you are well on your way to achieving your own piece of the American dream. However, what if your new home carried a dark secret? One that not only cast an evil aura over the house, but also put the lives of you and your family at risk of death by unnatural forces. That is the premise of the 1977 novel The Amityville Horror by J. Anson, which gives us the account of George and Kathy Lutz, who, along with their 3 children, moved into a Dutch colonial home situated in the neighborhood of Amityville, New York, that was being sold at quite the discount, only to later learn that it was the site of a gruesome mass murder the previous year. After staying for only 28 days in the house, they suddenly abandoned the house and all of their possessions, citing that they were being terrified by a number of paranormal phenomena. While we won't be discussing the validity of the claims of the Lutz family, nor will we be discussing the details of the real murders committed by Ronald DeFeo Jr., we will be discussing the film adaptations of the original novel. Representing the old, we have the 1979 film The Amityville Horror, directed by Stuart Rosenberg. Representing the new, we have the 2005 remake brought to us by director Andrew Douglas. Without further ado, let us begin with round 1. Since we are dealing with a story that is centered around the supernatural, it is only fitting that we discuss how both films present their supernatural elements. When it comes to the original film, the tone is set from the get-go with its striking red opening shot and iconic theme that starts out as optimistic before turning into a dark, macabre melody. It draws you into its world slowly by first starting on the house and then bringing you into the house on the night of the initial murders, juxtaposing the crash of thunder with the blasts of the rifle. This motif continues throughout the film as we mark the number of days from when the Lutzes first buy the house, all the way to the final day where they leave it for good. As for the supernatural elements, it makes use of a great deal of practical effects, but everything is presented in a manner where things happen almost out of the blue. Each supernatural moment is sudden, unexpected, unpredictable. On top of that, most of the supernatural elements are conveyed using normal objects within the scene, with only a few notable exceptions. Another important facet is that the supernatural elements are not limited solely to the house or the Lutz family, as we see how the malevolent forces within the house affect the people around them, such as Father Delaney, Kathy's Aunt Helena, who also happens to be a nun, Kathy's brother, who loses a large amount of cash in the home, and even the people working under George Lutz at his company. It isn't really until the climax of the film where we begin to see some of the more supernatural elements in plain view, but that comes after a slow boil of tensions throughout the film, and even during these moments, those elements come from previously established items, leaving the cause mostly ambiguous. The remake, on the other hand, beats you over the head with a number of supernatural elements that are explicitly shown, most notably through over-the-top CGI that has not aged well. While both films open on the DeFeo murders, the remake decides to send you into an epileptic fit with its bright, choppy flashes. The colors in the remake are also fairly muted within the home, save for the elements brought in by the Lutzes. On the one hand, it does communicate a nice sense of contrast between the house and its dark history, and the optimistic outlook of the Lutzes, but on the other hand, it removes any real sense of subtlety. Honestly, that's an underlying problem with the remake as a whole, as it does nothing to build a sense of mystery, opting to instead portray itself as a typical horror film from the early 2000s, where jump scares rule the day in lieu of any real sense of mystery and doom. It may have the story of a supernatural horror film, but it tries to present itself as a slasher film with extra computer effects. If you've ever wanted a case study that explained why less is more when it comes to ghost stories, studying these two films is a really good place to start. The original film takes its time to build up its sense of mystery and dread, while leaving the root cause of all the phenomena ambiguous, whereas the remake blasts through its story in order to show off its visual effects, thus robbing the film of any sense of mystery or subtlety. As such, it's quite obvious who the winner is. The original. Now that we have discussed the atmosphere of both films, let us take a look and see which one does a better job of telling its story. While both films pull from the same source material, this is another case where the difference is night and day. The original film is paced so that the supernatural elements escalate slowly. We see early foreshadowing for the events to follow as Father Delaney comes to bless the house, and from there, we are presented with a series of escalating incidents that start out seemingly mundane and dismissible, and ending on a horrifying discovery that finally drives the Lutzes out of the house. In addition to the family, Father Delaney is given a sizable amount of screen time as he tries to convince the members of his diocese of the threat the house poses to the Lutzes, and the ultimate toll the whole ordeal takes on him, eventually leaving him blind. We also have a recurring subplot involving the detective, Gianfrido, who investigated the original murders, following up on the Lutzes and Father Delaney. In the remake, the cast is greatly reduced, as our focus is primarily on the Lutzes, with more time being devoted to the children. The priest, here named Father Calloway, is mostly absent save for the second half of the film where he also attempts to bless the house, only to be forced out by the malevolent forces within in an over-the-top CG sequence. The scope of the supernatural events is also greatly limited to the Lutz family, with the only victim outside of the family being the babysitter, rewritten to be an irresponsible and somewhat creepy stoner who informs the children of the DeFeo murders. Another major change is with the spirit known as Jody. In the original, we never really learn who Jody was or is, as the film presents her as simply an extension of the malevolent forces that are dwelling within the house. The remake, on the other hand, presents Jody as the spirit of the fictional youngest daughter of the DeFeo family, whose soul is trapped in the room where she died. However, the film never really seems to decide whether she is intended to be a benevolent spirit trying to warn Chelsea about the malevolent forces in the house, or merely an extension of those forces as the unnecessarily over-the-top ending would have you believe. The biggest difference between the two films is the depiction of religion. The remake depicts the malevolent forces as being a curse placed upon the land by Jeremiah Ketchum, a deranged preacher from the 17th century who tortured Native Americans during his mission. As such, it frames both the original DeFeo murders and George's actions under the rationale that they were perceiving their family members as demons that needed to be slain. Conversely, religion is presented in a much more favorable light in the original film. The Lutzes are depicted as devout Christians who see their faith as a source of comfort and strength, as seen when they attempt to bless the house on their own in order to drive out the malevolent forces behind all of the phenomena. On top of that, Father Delaney's desperation to help the Lutzes is what compels him to action, even though it is ultimately his undoing as the whole affair costs him his sight. Unlike the remake, the revelation about Ketchum emerges from an organic exchange between George, his co-worker Jeff, and his girlfriend Carolyn, who is clairvoyant. In this version, she explains how the land the house sits on was once owned by John Ketchum, a satanic worshipper that was driven from Salem, Massachusetts around the time of the witch trials. Carolyn also explains to Jeff, and by extension the audience, that the house was built atop a burial site for the Shinnecock tribe. This exchange leads the three of them, later joined by Kathy, to discover the secret room in the basement that is effectively the portal to hell, leading to Carolyn's possession and subsequent breakdown. In the remake, this revelation is delivered via clunky exposition and another over-the-top sequence as George finds the ruins of Ketchum's mission in the basement and is basically doused in Ketchum's blood as the possession takes hold. All things considered, the remake merely comes across as a rushed horror film that only bears a passing resemblance to the original story. It sacrifices the sense of mystery and dread for the sake of over-the-top CGI and cheap scares, whereas the original takes its time to slowly pull you into the world and lets the mystery of the house carry you through. As such, this round goes to the old. And now for the final round, we are going to take a look at the character that is central to both versions, George Lutz, portrayed by James Brolin in the 1979 version and by Ryan Reynolds in the 2005 version. In both films, George is depicted as an everyman breadwinner. He's reluctant to buy the house at first, but decides to go through with the purchase at the behest of Kathy. However, the divergences we see in how the characters are portrayed have more to do with the structure of the two films and how the character is presented. Brolin's version of George comes across as a stoic, down-to-earth sort of person, more of a realist who's more at home with his tools than his feelings. Even as the house starts to exert its influence, he's fairly restrained for the most part, his emotional outbursts fairly minimal, as he tries to work out the anger through excessive woodcutting, seen most visibly as he throws the axe into the tree when Jeff comes to visit him. He's also a bit more resourceful, as in this version he also researches the history of the house and the supernatural forces at play in a bid to overcome what the house is doing to him. He fights the influence as best as he can, even during moments where the influence overtakes him. By the film's end, he's able to resist the urge long enough to get his family out of the house, even going back for the dog Harry. Reynolds' version, on the other hand, while still being the same down-to-earth everyman, is a lot more expressive. As a result, he comes across as someone who is more easily swayed by the house's influence, while at the same time being incredibly skeptical. While some people may be bothered by the tinges of comedy that he infuses into his dialogue, to Reynolds' credit, it actually makes his descent into madness more unsettling. It's like watching a parent or relative who's normally relaxed and easygoing suddenly becoming angry and shouting. It communicates the sense that those outbursts are out of character for him. If the film actually put more time into character development and less time into obnoxious visual effects, it would have been a standout performance. But as the film wears on into slasher film territory, the sense of fear and dread doesn't stay for very long, as he devolves from an interesting character to a bad Jack Nicholson impersonation. While less is more is a good adage to follow when it comes to the visuals of a ghost story, stories like the Amityville Horror are also reliant on the psychological aspects of possessions and hauntings. As such, you really need those moments that allow your characters to shine. Therefore, by virtue of simply having more time devoted to actually allowing us to get to know the characters and see the characters, this round goes to the old. While I would like to end this video by stating that there are elements from the remake that could be combined with elements from the original to produce a more ideal version of the Amityville Horror, that simply is not the case here. From the get-go, the remake suffers from a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes ghosts and hauntings scary. In a bid to show off their visual effects, they lose sight of the fact that the fear of the unknown, of forces we can't comprehend, and the fact that we will never know the answers is what makes for a good ghost story. By spelling out everything for the viewer, by showing what is actually happening and trying to create a clear origin, you take away that sense of mystery and thereby kill any possibility that what we are seeing could actually happen. And this is coming from someone who considers himself a skeptic of the paranormal. This is where the original film is at its strongest. By creating a sense of realism, acknowledging the fact that we don't have the answers to what lies on the other side of death, you create a story that terrifies the audience by letting their own imagination get away from them. That doesn't mean you don't show anything, you merely plant the seed of an idea, nurture it with equal parts faith and skepticism, and let the viewer do the rest. Another important factor to consider is the underlying fear that is being explored in the story, as that is ultimately the purpose of horror as a genre, to explore aspects of the human condition that we find less than desirable. In regards to the Amityville Horror, barring what facts may lie within the fiction, it could be argued that the underlying fears being explored here all revolve around money. Between the cost of the house, the disappearance of the cash for the wedding caterer, and even lines like, "They'll nickel and dime you to death," money and all of the anxieties surrounding it serve as a central theme to the film. with the Lutz's abandonment of the house being seen as a metaphor for the rejection of material wealth, and by extension, the root of all evil. As it states in the New Testament, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. First Epistle to Timothy, chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, New International Version. This clash ends in favor of the 1979 version of the Amityville Horror, the superior film. With that, this episode of MonsterClash now draws to a close. I hope you will join me again for another discussion of frightful fancy, as we leave behind the realms of hauntings and spirits, and instead explore a more mundane, but no less macabre interpretation of immortality. But for now, dear viewer, I bid thee good night.